Russia has moved onto high alert status as nearly 4,500 elite U.S. troops gather on the Poland-Ukraine border in what military analysts are calling the most serious escalation between NATO and Russia since the Ukraine war began, and while Washington describes this deployment as defensive, Moscow has labeled it a dangerous provocation that could ignite a direct clash between nuclear powers, creating a situation where the world once again fears a spiral toward confrontation similar to the Cold War era, but this time with actual combat already raging inside Ukraine, meaning the risks of escalation are far higher and the margin for error dangerously thin, because any miscalculation on this heavily militarized border could spark a chain of events that no one can control, and at the center of it all are these 4,500 American soldiers drawn from some of the most capable and combat-ready divisions of the U.S. Army, trained for rapid deployment in high-intensity conflict zones, bringing with them advanced weapons, armored vehicles, artillery systems, drones, and logistical support units that make them a formidable strike force ready for immediate action. Hello everyone, welcome back to my channel. Please subscribe and like my videos. According to U.S. officials, these troops will remain on the Polish side of the border and will not directly enter Ukraine, but their mission is clear: to reassure NATO allies, act as a deterrent against Russian expansion, and serve as a tripwire force, meaning that any attack against them would automatically trigger NATO's Article 5, drawing the entire alliance into war, and this is precisely why Russia views the deployment as a red line, with Kremlin spokespersons warning that Moscow cannot ignore such a buildup so close to its borders, and Russian state media framing the move as America's preparation for direct involvement in the Ukraine war. An accusation Washington denies, but one that nonetheless shapes Moscow's next military steps. Already, Russia has increased aerial surveillance flights along NATO's eastern frontier, mobilized additional missile batteries in Kaliningrad, and conducted live fire exercises with its Belarusian allies, signaling that it is ready to counter what it calls NATO's creeping encirclement. And this has fueled fears across Europe that the conflict could expand beyond Ukraine, dragging neighboring states into the war. For Poland, the arrival of U.S. troops is both a shield and a sword, as Polish leaders have openly welcomed American reinforcements, describing them as the strongest guarantee of national security since Poland joined NATO. But for ordinary citizens living near the deployment zones, the picture is more complicated because the presence of endless military convoys, the thunder of helicopters overhead, and the sight of foreign soldiers setting up bases in their towns is a stark reminder that their country sits on the front line of a potential world war. And while many Poles are proud to stand with NATO, others quietly fear that their homeland could become the battlefield if deterrence fails and confrontation erupts. The scale of the deployment is significant not only in numbers but in capability, as the troops include paratroopers capable of seizing and holding key terrain, mechanized units equipped with armored fighting vehicles, artillery brigades armed with precision rocket systems, and support elements that allow them to sustain combat for extended periods, effectively giving the US and NATO a rapid reaction force positioned just miles away from the Ukrainian front. And military experts argue that this makes NATO's defense line far more credible, but it also increases the chances of dangerous encounters with Russian forces who are actively probing NATO defenses with drones, cyber intrusions, and electronic warfare operations. In Moscow, the political reaction has been swift and severe, with senior officials accusing the US of escalating the war and promising symmetrical measures. A vague but threatening phrase that could mean redeployment of hypersonic missiles, larger naval patrols in the Baltic Sea, or increased support for hybrid operations against NATO members, including cyber attacks and disinformation campaigns designed to weaken Western resolve. And given Russia's track record, none of these threats can be dismissed, particularly at a time when Moscow feels cornered by Western sanctions, battlefield setbacks, and the growing unity of NATO. Ukraine, for its part, has hailed the deployment as further proof that the West is committed to its defense, even if indirectly, and Kiev believes that the presence of thousands of elite American soldiers just across the border acts as a shield that reduces the likelihood of Russia widening its operations westward, giving Ukraine more breathing space to concentrate on retaking occupied territories in the east and south, and Ukrainian officials have publicly praised the US and Poland for standing firm against what they call Russia's campaign of intimidation. Meanwhile, on the ground in Eastern Europe, the atmosphere is becoming more militarized by the day, with NATO conducting joint drills, Polish forces coordinating daily with their American counterparts, and Russian units across the border in Belarus staging live fire exercises that simulate an invasion scenario, creating a tense environment where both sides are constantly testing and measuring each other, heightening the risk that a single miscalculation could ignite a wider war. Analysts warn that history is full of moments when great powers stumbled into conflict, not through deliberate decisions but through accidents, misunderstandings, and escalation spirals. And the current buildup carries exactly those risks, as drones cross borders, missiles occasionally land in NATO territory, and electronic jamming interferes with civilian and military communication systems, all potential flashpoints that could trigger a rapid and uncontrollable escalation. In Washington, the Biden administration insists that the deployment is purely defensive, intended to bolster NATO's eastern flank and ensure that Russia understands the consequences of any aggression against alliance members, but critics argue that stationing 400-500 elite troops so close to Ukraine is an unnecessary gamble that risks dragging the US into direct war with Russia, a war that could escalate beyond conventional weapons given Moscow's nuclear arsenal. And even within Europe, while many governments welcome the American presence, there are quiet voices of concern that militarization of the border could lock both sides into an escalating standoff with no clear exit strategy. Yet from NATO's perspective, doing nothing would be even riskier, because allowing Russia to intimidate Poland or test NATO's resolve would weaken the alliance and embolden Moscow, potentially opening the door to further aggression not only in Ukraine but across Eastern Europe, meaning deployment is as much about psychology and deterrence as it is about actual battlefield readiness. The symbolism of 400-500 US troops standing watch at the edge of Ukraine is therefore enormous, sending a message to both allies and adversaries that America remains committed to defending Europe, even as Russia attempts to use fear and force to shift the balance of power. And whether this show of strength prevents escalation or hastens, it will depend on the decisions made in Moscow and Washington in the weeks ahead. For now, what is certain is that the deployment has raised the stakes in an already dangerous conflict, and as the war grinds on with no diplomatic breakthrough in sight, the world must brace for a future where the Poland-Ukraine border is not just a line on a map but the most critical fault line of global security, one that could determine whether the 21st century is defined by deterrence and stability, or by catastrophic confrontation between East and West.